Did you know that the medieval period, stretching roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, holds secrets about women's lives that might just flip your understanding of history? Have you been told women back then had no voice, no power, no rights at all? What if much of what we think we know is just wrong? Prepare to discover some truly unbelievable truths. Number 1. Medieval women were legally recognized as individuals with rights and responsibilities. For centuries, stories have echoed about medieval women being mere property, voiceless figures in a world dominated entirely by men. The common wisdom suggests a woman in the Middle Ages held no legal standing, that her father or husband controlled every aspect of her existence, from her inheritance to her very body. This picture often paints a world where a woman could not own land, conduct business, or represent herself in court. The reality, however, was often a surprising tapestry woven with threads of autonomy and legal recognition. In many parts of medieval Europe, particularly within the framework of customary law and later developing common law, women possessed a range of legal rights that defy the widespread property myth. Take, for instance, the concept of dower. Upon marriage, a woman often had a right to a portion of her husband's land, typically 1/3, for her lifetime should she outlive him. This dower was not merely a gesture, it was a legally enforceable claim, a form of security for a widow, ensuring she did not face destitution. A husband could not disinherit his wife from her dower right without her consent, and even then, legal processes were often involved. Records from England, for example, show countless court cases where widows successfully sued to claim their rightful dower lands, demonstrating their capacity to engage with the legal system and defend their interests. Beyond dower, women could inherit property, including land and goods, from their parents, especially in the absence of male heirs. While primogeniture, the system of inheritance by the firstborn son, was common among the nobility, it was not universal. In many peasant families, or in certain regions like parts of Scandinavia or southern France, daughters often inherited equally with sons or received significant portions. Even when a son inherited the primary estate, daughters were often provided with a dowry, which, while meant to establish them in marriage, also represented a transfer of wealth and, in some cases, conferred rights to certain properties or income streams that remained hers even after marriage. A fascinating aspect of medieval legal systems was the recognition of a woman's capacity to own and manage her own property, even while married. While the legal doctrine of coverture, where a married woman's legal identity was subsumed under her husband's, did exist in some places, its application was often more nuanced than commonly understood. Women frequently entered into prenuptial agreements, especially noble women, protecting their inherited lands or financial assets from their husband's control. These agreements, legally binding documents, stipulated how property would be managed, who would control specific revenues, and how assets would be divided upon death or separation. Wealthy widows, in particular, were powerful landowners managing vast estates, collecting rents, and overseeing agricultural production. They hired stewards, entered into contracts, and wielded considerable economic influence, all within the bounds of the law. The legal system also recognized a woman's ability to engage in business. From the bustling markets of Paris to the textile workshops of Flanders, women were actively involved in trade, crafts, and commerce. They ran taverns, brewed ale, baked bread, and sold goods. Many guild regulations, often seen as exclusive, explicitly allowed women to become members, especially widows who continued their deceased husbands' trades. These women, as guild members, held legal standing, could apprentice new workers, enforce quality standards, and represent their businesses. City records from places like London and Cologne contain numerous examples of women initiating legal proceedings, entering into contracts, and taking on debts, all indicators of their recognized legal personhood. Even in criminal law, women were not simply adjuncts to men. They were held accountable for their actions, tried in courts, and faced punishments. While the justice system was harsh for everyone, women were not immune from its reach, nor were they entirely without recourse. They could bring accusations, give testimony, and even appeal judgments. In cases of women suing for defamation, breach of contract, or even physical assault appear in court documents, illustrating their capacity to seek justice and assert their rights within the legal framework of the time. The idea of women being utterly propertyless and rightless fails to account for these many avenues through which medieval women exercised agency and legal standing. Number 2. Medieval women played vital roles in the economy and engaged in diverse occupations. The common narrative often suggests that medieval women were confined strictly to the domestic sphere, their lives circumscribed by the hearth and the nursery. This widely circulated image portrays women as solely responsible for household chores, childcare, and perhaps some spinning or weaving, a stark contrast to the male-dominated public world of work and commerce. However, historical records reveal a far more dynamic and integrated reality, where women were indispensable contributors to the medieval economy, engaging in a vast array of occupations spanning agriculture, crafts, trade, and even professions. In the agrarian landscape that dominated medieval Europe, women were fundamental to agricultural production. They toiled alongside men in the fields, participating in every stage of the farming cycle. From plowing and sowing to harvesting and threshing, women's physical labor was essential for survival. Manor records and illuminated manuscripts depict women driving oxen, gathering crops, milking cows, and tending to livestock. Their work extended beyond the fields to the processing of food, turning raw ingredients into edible products. They ground grain into flour, baked bread, brewed ale, and preserved fruits and vegetables. This was not merely household work, it was productive labor critical to feeding families and communities, often producing surplus goods for sale in local markets. Beyond the fields, women were deeply embedded in the craft and trade industries of medieval towns and cities. The textile industry, a cornerstone of the medieval economy, was heavily reliant on female labor. Women spun wool and flax into thread, wove cloth on looms, and performed intricate needlework. Many were professional weavers, dyers, and embroiderers, their skills highly valued. Guild records from various cities show women as active members, sometimes even as masters of their craft. In Paris, for example, the Livre des Métiers Book of Trades from the 13th century lists women as leaders in specific trades, including silk production and embroidery. These women operated their own workshops, employed apprentices, and managed their businesses, demonstrating significant economic independence and expertise. Women were also prominent in the provision of services and goods within urban environments. The brewing of ale, a staple drink for all social classes, was largely a female occupation. Lay wives were common figures in medieval towns, producing and selling their brews from their homes or designated establishments. They ran taverns, inns, and shops, managing finances, interacting with customers, and contributing directly to the urban economy. Many women were bakers, selling bread and pastries, or merchants, trading in various goods from fish and poultry to clothing and small wares. They were present in marketplaces, negotiating prices, and handling transactions. Some women even ventured into what might be considered more professional roles. While formal university education was largely closed to women, they found other avenues for intellectual and skilled work. Many women worked as scribes and illuminators, particularly within convents or for noble patrons, producing beautiful manuscripts. There were also women healers and apothecaries, using traditional knowledge of herbs and remedies to provide medical care, especially in rural areas where male physicians were scarce. While not formally doctors in the modern sense, their contributions to public health and individual well-being were invaluable. Even within the highest echelons of society, women were not idle. Noblewomen and queens managed vast household staffs, oversaw the production of goods for their estates, and administered properties in their husband's absence. They organized feasts, managed finances, and engaged in diplomatic correspondence. The economic and managerial skills required to run a large medieval household or estate were substantial, making noblewomen powerful economic actors in their own right. The idea that women were entirely absent from the world of productive labor and commerce is a clear oversimplification. Medieval society relied heavily on women's diverse contributions, recognizing their essential roles in sustaining families, communities, and the broader economy. Number 3. Medieval women had avenues for education and intellectual pursuits, particularly within convents. The popular imagination often conjures an image of medieval women as largely unlettered, their minds focused solely on domestic duties and religious piety, with no access to formal education or intellectual engagement. While universities were indeed primarily male institutions during this era. Yet dismissing medieval women as uneducated would be a profound oversight, ignoring the vibrant intellectual lives many women cultivated, especially within the unique spaces of convents and, for some, through private tutelage. Convents emerged as crucial centers of learning and intellectual activity for women during the Middle Ages. For many women, particularly those from noble or wealthy families, entering a convent offered an unparalleled opportunity for education that was largely unavailable elsewhere. Nuns were taught to read and write, not just in their vernacular language, but often in Latin, the universal language of scholarship, theology, and administration. This literacy allowed them to engage directly with sacred texts, theological treatises, and philosophical works. Beyond literacy, convents provided training in various arts and sciences of the time. Nuns copied and illuminated manuscripts, preserving ancient texts and creating new ones. They studied music, composed hymns, and practiced liturgical arts. Some convents maintained extensive libraries, serving as repositories of knowledge and fostering an environment of continuous learning. Prominent abbesses were not only spiritual leaders but also intellectual powerhouses, administering large monastic estates, overseeing significant building projects, and engaging in scholarly correspondence. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen, 1098 to 1179, stand as towering examples. This German abbess was a polymath who wrote extensively on theology, philosophy, medicine, botany, and even composed original music. Her writings, which included theological visions, scientific observations, and moral treatises, circulated widely and engaged with the leading thinkers of her day. She corresponded with popes, emperors, and kings, offering advice and critiques, demonstrating a level of intellectual authority and influence rarely associated with medieval women in the common narrative. Beyond the convent walls, some aristocratic women received private education. Noble families often hired tutors to instruct their daughters in literacy, Latin, French, and other languages, as well as history, mathematics, and rhetoric. While the purpose of this education often included preparing them for managing large households or serving as intelligent companions for their husbands, it nonetheless provided a foundation for intellectual engagement. Queens and high-ranking noblewomen like Eleanor of Aquitaine, 1122 to 1204, were patrons of arts and letters, fostering courts where troubadours composed poetry and scholars debated ideas. Their own letters and administrative documents sometimes reveal a keen intellect and a broad understanding of the world. Even among urban women, literacy was not entirely absent. The rise of vernacular literature meant that more women, especially those in merchant families, had access to books and could read for pleasure or practical purposes. Account books, household inventories, and personal letters reveal that many women could read and write, managing their own affairs or assisting in family businesses. While formal schooling might have been less common for the general female population compared to men, the ability to read and write was not a rare exception for women across all social strata. The emphasis on women's intellectual lives within religious orders also extended to those who did not take formal vows, such as the Beguines. These communities of devout women lived together without formal monastic enclosure, dedicating themselves to spiritual life, charitable work, and often intellectual pursuits. Many Beguines were literate, engaging with mystical texts, writing their own spiritual reflections, and contributing to the rich devotional literature of the period. Their existence challenges the notion that intellectual engagement was confined to a select few or to traditional monastic structures. The medieval period, far from being a dark age for female intellect, harbored numerous opportunities for women to cultivate their minds and leave lasting intellectual legacies. Number 4, medieval women exercised significant agency in matters of marriage and relationships. A pervasive myth surrounding medieval women is that they had absolutely no say in their own marriages, that unions were entirely arranged by fathers or male guardians, and that women were simply pawns in dynastic or economic games. This narrative often paints a picture of forced marriages, devoid of personal choice or emotional connection. While arranged marriages were certainly common, especially among the nobility, the reality was much more complex, revealing a surprising degree of female agency, consent, and even love in medieval marital practices. First, and perhaps most importantly, the Church, which held immense sway over social norms and legal practices, officially required the consent of both parties for a marriage to be valid. While this doctrine was often circumvented or pressured in practice, it provided a legal framework that could be invoked by women. If a woman could prove she was forced into a marriage against her will, the marriage could be annulled. Church courts handled countless cases related to marriage, and records show instances where women successfully argued that their consent was coerced or lacking. This principle, that genuine consent was a prerequisite for a sacramentally valid marriage, gave women a powerful, albeit sometimes difficult to exercise, tool for resisting unwanted unions. While parents certainly played a dominant role in selecting partners, particularly for their economic and social benefits, young people, especially later in the Middle Ages, were increasingly given a voice. Among the peasantry and urban working classes, marriages were often based more on practical considerations and mutual agreement, sometimes even involving an element of choice. Daughters often worked alongside their parents and had opportunities to interact with potential spouses within their communities. Elopement, though risky, was also a recognized, albeit frowned upon, way for couples to marry against parental wishes, with the Church often recognizing such unions as valid if consent was clearly demonstrated. Beyond the initial formation of marriage, women often held agency within their marital relationships. The concept of dower, discussed earlier, provided a widow with economic security and independence upon her husband's death, allowing her to manage property and often remain unmarried. While remarriage was common, especially for younger widows, many chose to remain single, maintaining control over their inherited assets and their own lives. These women often wielded significant economic and social power, acting as heads of households and engaging in business. Moreover, while love matches in the modern sense were not the primary drivers of marriage for most social classes, emotional bonds and companionship were valued within medieval marriages. The letters, poems, and wills from the period often express affection and mutual respect between spouses. It was not uncommon for couples to grow to love each other within an arranged marriage, and the absence of such affection could certainly lead to marital discord. The Church, while emphasizing procreation and stability, also recognized the importance of companionship within marriage. Even in cases of marital breakdown, women had some recourse. While divorce as we understand it today was largely impossible, annulment was the only way to dissolve a valid marriage. Legal separation, divorce mensa et thoro, or from bed and board was possible in cases of adultery, cruelty, or desertion. Women could initiate such proceedings, seeking separation from abusive husbands and sometimes even financial support. While navigating these legal processes was undoubtedly challenging, the very existence of these avenues demonstrates that women were not entirely powerless within their marital relationships and could seek legal redress when their well-being or dignity was threatened. The idea of medieval women as entirely passive in their marital destinies simply does not align with the historical evidence. Number 5. Women held significant power and influence in various societal roles, including as regents, abbesses, and noblewomen. The idea that medieval women were universally powerless, relegated to the background, and stripped of any meaningful authority is a stubborn myth. While society was undeniably patriarchal, a closer look at the diverse roles women occupied reveals numerous instances where they wielded considerable power, exercised influence, and held significant authority, particularly within the realms of royalty, nobility, and the church. They were not mere figureheads, but active participants in shaping politics, managing vast estates, and guiding spiritual communities. One of the most visible demonstrations of female power was the role of the regent. When a king or powerful lord died, leaving a young or absent heir, his wife, mother, or sister often stepped in as regent to govern on his behalf. These women effectively ruled kingdoms, managed military campaigns, conducted diplomacy, and administered justice. Eleanor of Aquitaine, already mentioned, was a queen of France and then England, a powerful feudal lord in her own right, and a regent for her son Richard the Lionheart. Blanche of Castile, mother of Louis IX of France, was another formidable regent. She skillfully navigated complex political intrigues, quelled rebellions, and secured her son's throne, demonstrating astute political acumen and military leadership. These regents issued laws, raised taxes, and commanded armies, directly exercising the highest forms of temporal power. Within the church, abbesses were figures of immense authority and influence. The abbess of a powerful double monastery, like the one at Whitby under Hilda, or the imperial abbeys in Germany, commanded vast wealth, extensive lands, and numerous tenants. They presided over both male and female monastic communities, managed large estates, administered justice within their ecclesiastical territories, and were often consulted by kings and popes on matters of spiritual and temporal importance. These women were highly educated, politically astute, and fiscally responsible, proving their capability as administrators and leaders. The power of an abbess rivaled that of a bishop or a powerful baron, and their spiritual authority gave them moral standing within society. Noblewomen, even when not regents or abbesses, wielded significant power within their own spheres. The lady of the castle, in her husband's frequent absences due to warfare, pilgrimage, or court duties, was often responsible for managing the entire estate. This included overseeing agricultural production, administering justice in the manorial court, handling finances, and defending the castle if necessary. They trained squires, oversaw the education of their children, and managed a large household staff. These responsibilities required sharp administrative skills, a strong will, and the ability to command respect and obedience from a large retinue of vassals and servants. The letters and household accounts from the period reveal these women as active and intelligent managers, essential for the smooth functioning of their estates. Beyond the formal structures of power, women exercised informal but potent influence. As wives, mothers, and sisters, they served as advisors to powerful men, mediating disputes, forging alliances through marriage, and acting as cultural arbiters. Queens often acted as diplomats, negotiating peace treaties or arranging advantageous marriages for their children. Saintly women and mystics, like Catherine of Siena, wielded moral authority that transcended gender, advising popes and influencing political decisions through their spiritual prestige and impassioned advocacy. The image of the entirely powerless medieval woman fails to account for these many ways in which women actively participated in and shaped the political, social, and religious landscape of their time. Their power might not always have been identical to that of men, but it was undeniably present and impactful. Number 6, medieval women were not exclusively valued for beauty or childbearing, but also for skills, wisdom, and economic contributions. The popular narrative often oversimplifies the value placed on medieval women, reducing their worth primarily to their physical beauty, their ability to produce heirs, and their dowry. This perspective suggests that once a woman was married or beyond childbearing years, her value diminished significantly. However, historical evidence presents a much richer and more complex understanding of how women were esteemed, recognizing their diverse skills, their wisdom, their piety, and their indispensable economic contributions to family and community. While beauty and fertility were certainly factors considered in marriage alliances, particularly among the nobility, they were far from the only or even primary criteria. For the vast majority of the population, practical considerations were paramount. A woman's skills in household management, her ability to work in the fields, her proficiency in a trade like spinning, weaving, or brewing, and her overall industriousness were highly valued. A family looking for a daughter-in-law would prioritize a woman who was capable, hardworking, and could contribute meaningfully to the household economy. Records of peasant life and urban apprenticeships show that girls were trained from a young age in various skills, not just domestic ones, because their labor was critical to the family's survival and prosperity. And wisdom, judgment, and character were also highly regarded qualities in medieval women. This is particularly evident in the respect accorded to older women. Grandmothers, wise women, and experienced widows often held significant informal authority within families and communities. They served as advisors, mediators of disputes, and repositories of traditional knowledge, especially concerning medicine, childcare, and agricultural practices. Their experience was seen as a valuable asset, and their counsel was often sought. The idea that women were discarded after their youth ignores the reverence often shown for their accumulated wisdom and matriarchal influence. Piety was another profoundly important characteristic that elevated a woman's status and respect. In a deeply religious society, a woman known for her devotion, charity, and moral uprightness was highly esteemed. Female saints, mystics, and devout laywomen commanded immense respect and spiritual authority. Their spiritual insights were sought after, and their virtuous lives were held up as examples. The spiritual value transcended physical appearance or marital status, giving women a powerful avenue for influence and veneration within their communities. Beyond these individual qualities, women's economic contributions were foundational to medieval society. As discussed before, women were integral to agriculture, crafts, and trade. They produced food, made clothes, managed businesses, and contributed directly to family income. A woman's labor was not merely supplementary, it was often essential. The loss of a wife, particularly in a peasant or artisan household, could be economically devastating, highlighting the indispensable nature of her work. Even for noblewomen, their ability to manage estates, oversee household production, and administer finances directly contributed to the family's wealth and standing. Their value extended far beyond procreation to their active and vital roles in sustaining the economic fabric of their society. The portrayal of medieval women as solely defined by their biology or superficial attributes misses the profound appreciation for their multifaceted contributions. They were valued for their strength, their intelligence, their diligence, their spiritual depth, and their practical skills, all of which were essential for the functioning of medieval families, communities, and the broader economy. The emphasis on beauty and childbearing is a modern simplification that fails to capture the true breadth of qualities that made medieval women integral and respected members of their society. Number 7. Medieval women actively participated in spiritual life and held significant religious authority. The common misconception often suggests that medieval women were passive recipients of religious doctrine, limited to roles as pious parishioners with no real agency or authority within the church. The image of a strictly patriarchal ecclesiastical structure dominated by male clergy overshadows the vibrant and diverse ways in which women actively shaped and participated in medieval spiritual life, often holding positions of considerable religious authority and influence. Convents, as mentioned before, were not just places of education, but also powerful spiritual centers where women exercised direct religious authority. Abbesses, particularly of large and wealthy monasteries, held spiritual jurisdiction over their nuns and often over local communities, even occasionally over male monks or clergy in their monastic territories. They administered sacraments, heard confessions, though not absolving sins in the same way as priests. They heard confessions of spiritual state and directed spiritual practices. They were often responsible for the moral and spiritual well-being of hundreds of individuals, their authority recognized by bishops and popes. Figures like Hilda of Whitby not only ruled their monastic houses, but also hosted important ecclesiastical synods and guided political leaders, demonstrating a profound spiritual and temporal influence. Beyond formal monastic structures, women were instrumental in the development of mystical traditions that profoundly influenced medieval spirituality. Figures like Julian of Norwich, a solitary anchoress, experienced profound visions and wrote theological treatises that are still studied today. Her Revelations of Divine Love is considered one of the earliest surviving books written by a woman in English and offers deep insights into the nature of God's love. Mechthild of Magdeburg, a German beguine, wrote intense mystical poetry, her words expressing a passionate, direct relationship with the divine that resonated widely. These women, through their direct experiences and written works, offered alternative spiritual paths and interpretations that challenged formal theological structures, demonstrating a powerful, independent religious authority. The Beguine movement, a unique form of religious life for women that emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries, further illustrates female religious autonomy. These women lived in communities, often supporting themselves through manual labor, dedicating their lives to prayer, asceticism, and charitable work without taking formal monastic vows. They engaged in intense spiritual practices, intellectual pursuits, and often preached or offered spiritual guidance to others. While sometimes viewed with suspicion by the church hierarchy, their existence and growth demonstrate a grassroots movement where women shaped their own spiritual lives and exerted influence within their communities, independent of traditional male-led institutions. Women also played critical roles in the lay piety movements that swept through medieval Europe. They joined confraternities, participated in pilgrimages, and engaged in acts of charity. Many women were spiritual advisors to their families, teaching religious principles to their children and servants. Wealthy noblewomen often founded monasteries, endowed chapels, and commissioned religious art and texts, acting as significant patrons of the church and directly influencing its development. Their economic power translated into significant spiritual influence, as they could shape the landscape of religious institutions and practices. The cult of the Virgin Mary, which blossomed in the High Middle Ages, also elevated the feminine within Christian spirituality, providing a powerful female figure for devotion and veneration. Women often identified strongly with Mary, finding in her a model of piety, strength, and intercession. The emphasis on female saints, martyrs, and mystics provided numerous role models for women to aspire to spiritual excellence and authority. The idea that women were entirely excluded from spiritual leadership or significant religious authority fundamentally misrepresents the diverse and active roles they held within the complex tapestry of medieval Christian life.